The Defence Minister says Australians need to take a deep breath over the Chinese warships off Australia's east coast. It comes as political debate intensifies over the government's response to the live fire drills conducted last week. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts joins me now. And Stephen, what are some of the questions over the government's response to these drills?
Yeah, one of the main questions that's emerged is just how long did it take the government to get notified of the fact that China was apparently beginning these live fire drills just under a week ago. Now, we learnt through evidence that was given to Senate estimates over yesterday and earlier that the government was only notified via Air Services Australia, who was tipped off by a Virgin pilot around half an hour after the window opened for the exercises to begin. But then it took another hour or so for the formal notification to come through from the New Zealand Navy, which was at that point monitoring the vessel. Now, unsurprisingly, there's been a lot of questions which the opposition and others have put to the government about that delay. Was that delay acceptable? Why did the government have to rely on being tipped off by pilots on commercial airlines to know that this was happening? Now, the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has fielded those questions today. He says that people don't need to be worried about the response because if there was a real security threat, as opposed to simply an issue where the government and the Navy was monitoring a task group, then the response would be much more quick than it was in this instance. He's also said that Australians need to keep this in perspective. Now, the opposition and some commentators say that there are some really alarming things about this task force. It's an unprecedented display of naval power by China in our region. They say there's a clear signalling that's happening here from China about its growing naval strength. And the opposition's accused the government on fixating on its legality. They say pointing out that it's legal under international law misses the strategic significance of what this exercise represents. Richard Marles, though, responded to that today, saying no, in the end, the fact that this was legal does matter, and the fact that China wasn't breaking international law is significant. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
What we have today is a capable defence force, and I am confident that we are able to manage events of this kind. Final point I want to make is this. It's really important that we take a deep breath here. Our touchstone has to be international law. The Chinese task group, as I'm advised, is complying with international law. And why that matters is because there's actually a greater frequency of Australian Navy vessels closer to China than there are Chinese vessels closer to Australia. And we rely heavily on our rights under international law to be there. And it matters that we're there because that's where our trade routes are. And so we've got to use international law as our touchstone.
Stephen, how has this played into the political debate over Australia's relationship with China?
Yeah, unsurprisingly, the government's strategy with China, which it's called loosely stabilisation of ties, has come under scrutiny. The opposition says that this exercise isn't really consistent with a stabilised relationship, and they've suggested that the government's response has been excessively weak. Now, this morning, the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, really rounded on the opposition over this argument during a Senate Estimates Committee. She said that Peter Dutton and Andrew Hastie were employing inflammatory and dangerous, reckless language on the relationship. And she also said that that stabilisation didn't necessarily mean that there wouldn't be any disagreements or clashes of interest between Australia and China. Her argument is that stabilisation is still a useful strategy and framework for the government to use to deal with differences that emerge as an increasingly assertive China continues to push its national interests. Let's listen to an exchange between the coalition frontbencher James Paterson and Senator Wong, the Foreign Minister, on this topic during Senate estimates this morning.
Is their conduct consistent with what I understood to be a shared vision of a stabilised bilateral relationship?
Well, I have answered your question, Senator. You see, you imply, and some of the commentators I've seen seem to suggest that stabilisation was a view that somehow China wouldn't do things with which we didn't agree and we wouldn't do things with which China didn't agree. That's not correct. It is a way of understanding how you maturely deal with a relationship where you have interests that at times differ and how do you manage those differences? How do you navigate them wisely? I mean, you could. The alternative is we just yell. That doesn't keep Australians safer.
Unsurprisingly, of course, the coalition rejects that, but nonetheless, I think it will be interesting to see exactly how China emerges, if at all, as a point of debate during this election campaign. During the last election campaign, China's presence in the Pacific, and specifically its agreement with Solomon Islands, stirred quite a lot of election debate. The consensus has been that foreign policy may not feature quite the same way this time around, but perhaps this live-fire drill, as well as the enormous tectonic shifts we're seeing in strategic policy across the globe in the wake of Trump, might change that equation somewhat.